Calling all beings. Calling all beings.
Yeah, baby! Woo! Welcome back to Calling All Beings. It has been a minute. I'm your host, DJ, and I am so excited to be back with my fam with an amazing guest tonight. And I'm going to tell you, when I heard this brother referring to the guy who had basically he took a Native American word and as Matt says, anglicized. I said, man, Nathan, he had him at anglicized.
Tell me more.
Yeah, so we're so excited about that, and because he's speaking Nathan's language. Let's say it like that. So without further ado, the co-creator, co-conspirator of this fun, interesting, and entertaining look at UFOs, the executive producer of The Joint, Money Nathan. What's up, brother?
What is going on, y'all? Good to be back on the show. It does feel like it's been forever, but it's so cool to be with you guys and to have Priscilla with us tonight. I'm very excited about this show. It's really good.
Yeah. So we're gonna get to her in a second, but one of the original gangsters of this thing, the mental health technician, the woman who we just love. She's a paragon of the virtue of this joint. At a study of UAPs, the host of Deb's Data Dojo. What's up, Deb?
AKA Bigfoot babysitter. Also, I am here.
We're gonna get to that. We're going to see what Matt has to say about that, man, because, who knows? I mean, we just don't know what we don't know, right? The host of Quantum Witch Cafe and a new joint that just came up that's being on Vinny Adams' channel and is part of his network. But the Quantum Witch Cafe UFO Book Club, a very learned individual, someone that we all love and respect. And she was in this documentary film Phenomenology. So put those hands together for Priscilla Stone, the Quantum Witch.
I love it. I love the way you say my name. And thank you for having me. It's so great to see Nathan and Deb. And Nathan, it's been too long. DJ,
Forever.
I talk to you like weekly, so it's not been too long.
It's just like, peace out, DJ. I've got
You
too much
again.
of you already. All right, so I'm in a hotel room, so this is why I'm not yelling as loud. They're probably going to get a call at the front desk.
Lies. I thought you were in space.
I love it. It's what I love about StreamYard. But I'll tell you what. So this gentleman, I had heard about this gentleman. I want to ask him. I believe that he was part of the crew of Finding Bigfoot. He is a multi-decade researcher. And when I heard him speak, I was just like, man, this guy is just brilliant, man. I just love listening to the way that he broke it down. I heard him on Tim and Dana's Bigfoot Influencers first, but I've also heard him speak on his own podcast because I listen every week. He has a new book. And this new book, let me see, the title here is The Phenomenal Sasquatch, Seeking the Origins of a Cultural Icon, a book that demonstrates his dedication to unraveling the truth behind this intriguing mystery that has certainly played a big part in my life and has me out in the woods. So party people, put those hands together for North Georgia's own Mr. Matt Pruitt. Put those hands out. Let me see something up in there.
Thanks for having me. North Georgia's own. I'll take it. That's still home. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, but this is one of those towns where nobody here is from here. And so I definitely fall into that category for sure.
Oh, but there's a lot of musician brothers up in there, right? So you got people, you can get a jam session, right?
The most talented musicians in the country all move here and compete for gigs. And so, I mean, you walk down Broadway and every guitar player is absolutely phenomenally incredible. And so I don't know if I could hang with a lot of those people. There's some really talented people here.
It's so interesting because when you say that, Matt, I've been friends with guitar player and I love to talk music with people that play music because I don't. And is it inspirational? What do you feel like when you see someone play guitar? And you're obviously a really good guitar player yourself. You performed live, hundreds of shows, right? So what is it like when you see a guitar player that's just awesome?
Well, I think we all gravitate towards the things that are just out of our reach. And so, like, my favorite vocalists very often tend to be people that are just so far beyond what I'm capable of. Because I grew up playing guitar and singing. I was in bands and I was in a major label band for a few years in my early 20s. And so, there's certain like niches of things that just escape me. And so those are the things I gravitate towards. And so there's certain like technicality that certain players have. And again, I've never been a country music fan. I'm still not. But a lot of that like chicken picking is super technical and really difficult. And there's so many of those players in town that are amazing. And because that's not my realm, that stuff blows me away. When it's too close to home, you can sort of like when I hear a lot of stuff that's in that rock and roll sort of vein, I hear it through the experience of having played it for so long or recording it. And so it's hard for me to break out of like the analytical mind of like, oh, that's is that an 18-inch kick drum or a 24-inch kick drum? Or, oh, that's a Strat in the second or fourth position, or, oh, those are humbuckers, or that sounds like, versus when it's another genre that I don't wrap my head around, I just take it in and like, oh, wow, this is beautiful, even though it's not my thing. So there's a lot of that in Nashville for sure.
And speaking of things just out of your reach, I kind of feel that way about hair growth. It's kind of here, but getting that center to come back, it hasn't happened. I've asked different UFO experiencers if there's a key that the phenomenon has that they could unlock hair regrowth, and I haven't gotten there yet. But so I understand what you mean in that regard. Money Nathan, so what is it? How many people do we know in ufology? And Matt was saying on another interview that he did about how many musicians there are. Could you guys hit that up real quick, you and Matt?
I mean, there's at least a few. I know we had Simeon Hein on with us, and he actually played at the end of the show. That was really cool. Darren,
that's right,
is also a musician. Darren Exo Academian is a musician, and he was in some bands when he was younger. Plays several different instruments. Of course, I can think of Sean Rash as well. He's a very talented guy with a lot of songwriter, musician, and plays several instruments also. So yeah, I mean, it's Benji. I mean, there's so many.
There's so many.
It's a talented batch. We're drowning in the riches of our talent, which is great.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in Sasquatchery too. And I think it is that the big 5 personality traits, one of which being openness, and it's typically described as like openness to experience, but that's also the creativity realm. And so, the higher you are in trait openness, very often the more you see the associations between things, you tend to be a more associative or lateral thinker. And I think people that have that personality trait in abundance tend to be able to see the connections between, let's say, like the known scientific realm and things that are currently within the unknown, to be able to make sense of them. And they also happen to be driven creatively. So very often they are musicians. And so I don't know if you're all familiar with Micah Hanks. Micah's a good friend of mine.
Absolutely.
He's been on the show. Yeah.
He is a great student of the Sasquatch subject, and obviously like a great student of the UFO subject as well. And he's a fantastic musician and a great friend. I think the world of Micah. Cliff Barrickman's a musician. Lyle Blackburn. Wow. I mean, my friend Daryl Collier with the NAWAC, he and I both appear on, we had a podcast that we did semi-regularly, although we're overdue for an episode for the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. But a lot of people don't realize, like, he's an incredible musician. He's an amazing guitar player. He writes great songs, and he has an amazing singing voice. And so there are a lot of musicians in these fields, but I think it's because of that, the highness in trait openness.
Wow. And Daryl's an Air Force linguist. He and I could have actually flown together, except that I think he was in he wasn't in the same command as I think he was like ACC or something. But I think I know the airplanes he flew on. But yeah, we could have actually been paired together because I think we crossed over. So that's cool, man. Way cool. All right, let's jump into it. Money, do you want to go first, brother?
I can't wait to get started. I want to get into the book, but before I get there, I want to make sure we set a little groundwork. So Matt, can you tell our audience a little bit about what was your on-ramp into the study of Sasquatch? How did you get started on this path?
Well, I'll try to make it short because I've told this story so many times over the last, 15 plus years of doing interviews and things like that. So people can go find that elsewhere. But I did have an experience when I was young. I was 17. I was with 4 other people, and it was outside of Helen, Georgia, where I grew up in the Northeast Georgia mountains there. Now, we didn't see the things. We basically heard sounds that included vocalizations that are now I know are characteristic or often attributed to the Sasquatch phenomenon. branches breaking, brush being thrashed, and vegetation, being shaken. A tree was broken and pushed over very loudly, and we didn't know what we were experiencing because we knew it wasn't other human beings because of the context. It was very densely forested environment at night, and then we knew it wasn't bears or deer or something of that nature, and so it was just an anomalous experience that we didn't know what to attribute it to. And the place that we were visiting, that we were exploring at night, had a reputation for being a haunted or spooky place. And so it seemed like, well, yeah, weird things do happen there, I guess, because I grew up in that area and did a lot of, camping and a lot of hiking, a lot of fishing with my dad. And so never experienced anything like that before, despite all the time in, wild places in Southern Appalachia. And so later I stumbled on Sasquatch information online, which I thought was ludicrous and preposterous. The idea of these big lumbering apes, hurling stones at people and smelling terrible and, generally like running away from people. But then I started to really dig into eyewitness testimonies and found people's, claims that read exactly like the experience that we had. And then finding vocalization recordings or other sound recordings that were not only identical to what we heard, but during that initial encounter, a friend of mine had a VHS-C camcorder. And so we have a lot of the sounds recorded. Now, mostly you just see dense foliage at night. You don't really see anything, but you can hear the sounds. And so that was the impetus to go, oh, I've got to get to the bottom of looking into this. Could that have been what we experienced? Are there really animals that fit the description offered by Sasquatch claimants? And could they occur in Southern Appalachia? Because it was so tightly associated with the Northwest, almost exclusively for so long in the last half of the 20th century, let's say. And so I thought, well, I'll just get to the bottom of this and figure it out. And now it's been 20 plus years and I'm still trying to get to the bottom of it and figure it out. I haven't seen one, so I can't claim that I have that sort of gnosis that one would achieve from a visual sighting. But I've had other experiences over the years and traveled all over the country, moved all over the country, done extensive field research, interviewed many hundreds of witnesses, and on and on and on. So it's been quite a fun and wild journey for sure.
That's fantastic.
Bro, I was going to say, we're going to get into that bit about Western North Carolina. You were talking about the 3 days during the year of research. And so we're going to get into that, but I can't get in the way of the freight train that is my co-host, Deb.
Yeah, so I was thinking when you made those comments about being creative and how that seems to draw people into both cryptids and the phenomenon in general, and the paranormal. I was wondering if you feel like this journey has been a transformative path for you. Has it been almost a spiritual path for you personally? Because it becomes like that for others.
Oh, absolutely. There is no doubt about it. And I think for a lot of years, I tried to maybe not reject that, but I certainly denied it. And not only was I denying it publicly, but I was definitely denying it to myself. And there's a bit towards the end of the book about that, spoiler alert. And I do think it's because, when you're investigating or trying to contend with some sort of what the rest of the world might think of as like a fringe idea or a fringe phenomena or something taboo that's relegated to the realm of, just like silly campfire stories, you have this desire to sort of make it as intellectual a pursuit as possible, because it is an intellectual pursuit. There's no doubt about that, and you're trying to be as responsible as you possibly can be in evaluating claims and, developing your expertise across the relevant disciplines so that you can have, a reliable sort of method of looking at evidence to evaluate it for yourself or experiences that you have in the field. And so I think I've heard other people say it, and I know I said it when I was younger, this like, oh, this is not an emotional pursuit. This is purely an intellectual pursuit. This is a scientific pursuit. And it's like, the reality is it is a pursuit of meaning to a very large degree. And now you can either recognize that and then embrace it and then let that fuel you, or you can just deny it and reject it and feel the misery that comes with not accepting that. But, not to belabor the point that's in the book, because it's certainly not like the end of the book, but it's towards the end. So people, if they end up reading it, they'll see this particular portion. But I would say that all of these things that we pursue, first of all, you have no control over what it is that you're interested in, because there's an infinite number of things in the world. I mean, there's an infinite number of things in this room I could be interested in if I wanted to be. And so it's not like you have this decision tree and you pick and choose to be interested in this to the exclusion of everything else. It's just things call to you. You know, that's why they call it a calling, or, you know, a
Right.
vocation, these sorts of things. And so, you know, I have no control over the fact that I've been like relentlessly obsessed with trying to figure this out for 20 years. And so, you know, you end up putting it at the top of your sort of hierarchy of goals, let's say, or it becomes one of the most important things. And that is transformative in and of itself, because there's things that you have to do, especially if you're being realistic about defining your expectations and like, well, what is it that I want to accomplish? Like, well, I've had experiences and I've seen things that, you know, seemed like, let's say, tracks, you know, impressions that I would say, well, those look like what other people call Sasquatch tracks. And so if I were trying to answer the question solely to my own satisfaction, then I certainly could have said, well, I'll set the bar however high or low, you know, I could have chosen to, and said, okay, I figured this out. I'm good. I don't need to pursue this anymore. I've answered the question. But if you think, well, I want to answer this question to the satisfaction of others and potentially society, well, now you have to abide by their standards. You know, if you want to demonstrate something to the institutions, let's say, you know, academic, governmental, scientific institutions, well, you don't get to set the bar however high or low you want. You have to abide by their standards. And those are pretty high. And so you have to aim up at that. And you have to sort of draw upon the inspiration that the subject gives you, or the pursuit gives you, the meaning, the pursuit of that meaning, and allow that to guide you to try to like be better, conduct yourself in a better way, be smarter, learn more, be more charitable, be more forgiving. And so it's definitely transformative across a number of different dimensions, I would say. And it is a pursuit of meaning. And I think that happens on both sides. I mean, because even the staunchest skeptics or cynics, let's say, they're still pursuing meaning, even though they very often will say this is purely an intellectual pursuit. It's like, no, we both have, it's all built upon an imaginative fantasy, you know, because you have a vision of the future, and that's a fantasy, right? I mean, that's you sort of daydream about like what the greater good would look like. And so for the proponents, it's like, well, these things need discovery. Maybe they need to be protected. Maybe their habitat needs to be protected. So all these things that I'm doing is going to bring about this greater good. And it has a moral aim. You know, it will vindicate researchers who've dedicated their lives to it. It will vindicate and validate witnesses who've suffered ridicule and disbelief, etc. Well, the skeptics are no different, because they think that like, oh, well, there's this sort of you know, the cult of Sasquatchery, and we need to liberate people from these false beliefs, and we need to slay the proverbial dragons of pseudoscience.
The
And so
same
they're
for the
still,
UFO.
yeah, they're engaged in a moral aim with a sort of visionary outcome of like a utopian greater good end point. And so anything you're interested in that you're pursuing is a pursuit of meaning rested upon a sort of a fantasy with a moral aim or trajectory, like a moral will, let's say. And so as I got older, I started to realize that and was like, well, I should just lean into that, because that's what fuels me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have dealt with so much of the trouble or heartache or headache or everything that comes along with, you know, failure and disappointment and, you know, like thinking, because I really thought when I first got into it, like, oh yeah, I'll figure this out in no time. I'll see one in a matter of time, you know, and I'll figure out what they are, and I'll get photographs and I'll get video. And it's like, I don't have any of that stuff, but I love the pursuit. And so it is definitely transformative. And, you know, I think interviewing very compelling witnesses, every one of those experiences is transformative. And having experiences yourself in the field, those are transformative. You know, we all have that sort of initiation, right? Like you had said, like, what's the on-ramp? I love that term, by the way.
That's one of his favorites.
And many of us, a lot of people, it's because they had an experience that they couldn't explain conventionally. You know, there's no prosaic explanation that's like, oh, it was a deer, it was a bear, it was a person, whatever the case may be. So that's like the initial initiation into this sort of pursuit, you know, and then you're constantly seeking renewals of that initiation. That's why we seek to have other experiences, other points of contact with the phenomenon, and those are all rooted in a pursuit of meaning. And so, I'm more than happy to admit that it's more than just an intellectual pursuit for me, and it is very transformative for sure.
That could be a song title, maybe More Than a Feeling. Do you think that that could hit?
I
So
think,
anyway,
I
yeah.
think that sounds like it could hit, especially if you're from a certain city in the in the Northeast.
In the Northeast, yeah. So one thing I was just going to say, just to follow up, I would also argue, people that would say that they're in pursuit of just science. I think people want to go out and they want a feeling, because, science, you're talking about, okay, we're going to go down to the lab today. We're going to perform some experimentation in many cases. In the case of Bigfoot, there's a lot that you have to go through to get yourself out there. And for a lot of people, they want to have a feeling, and that feeling can happen when you're in the presence of something that is really the same reason people ghost hunt and things. You know what I mean? Is you get in the woods, you maybe hear, if you hear that howl, as you've heard, as you said, you talked about, you have to fight through it because your instinct is, I'm headed back to the car right now. But you power through it, and then maybe you can get some analysis on what you're listening to. So, but you know what? I don't want to babble anymore because I got to get the quantum witch in here. So go ahead, please, Priscilla. I'll get back with Matt here in a minute.
Thank you.
Yes,
So I
ma'am.
think that my biggest question is, because so many people that have experienced these things and study these things have like experience upon experience. And even if you only have one, you are talking to people that have had these experiences. Has your research in this field, has it had you question like the place of yourself in this universe and even honestly in this dimension, or like our place just possibly co-evolving with these beings?
Not necessarily, just because I spent so much time studying analogous mammals, other mammals that live similar lifestyles, whether they're generalized omnivores or, even animals that are very rare and far ranging over large home ranges and things like that. And so I see so many analogs between the animals that are described by the Sasquatch phenomenon and other animals that we understand well now, that to me, they fit perfectly in the framework of the natural world. So it definitely gave me a deeper appreciation and a greater love for the natural world, and for, digging in as obsessively as I could about related disciplines like evolutionary biology and ecology and these related fields. But it didn't necessarily change my place or my perception of my place, like in the ranking order of the natural world, or even from to your point, like a almost dimensional or maybe even metaphysical sort of perspective. Because to me, these are just perfectly normal animals that happen to be very rare, and due to their lifestyle and the evolutionary pressures that shape them, again, if they exist, if there really is a biological root to the Sasquatch phenomenon, which is what I argue in the book. But the evolutionary pressures that created these things make them very difficult to detect or to observe on demand. And so there's this sort of paradoxical thing where, like you said, there are so many people that have experiences and that are willing to disclose those. And there's many more people who don't disclose them publicly. Like the vast majority of witnesses that I've interviewed were willing to tell me confidentially under the agreement that I would never, publish their story or something of that nature, which is unfortunate because some of them are so compelling, and they're, some of them are really stellar professionals, which is one of the things, and I'm sure you deal with this in the UAP realm. Are we saying UAP now? I'm still like, because I'm not a student of that subject.
Yeah.
I still want
The fancy people
I still
say
want to
UAP.
say. I still
Well,
want
there's
to
a
say
reason for it,
UFO.
but yeah, there's a reason for it.
Oh, I understand, but
Yeah.
it's sort of like the organization that I work with, the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. They had sort of set up that nomenclature in that organization well before I joined, but it was an attempt to sort of shed the baggage of the term Bigfoot or Sasquatch. But what inevitably happens is people go, what's a wood ape? Oh, it's a Sasquatch. It's like, what's a UAP? Oh, it's a UFO.
It's
It's like, well, why don't we just use the original word?
Yes.
But I'm sure this happens in the UFO world, is that the general public tends to confer certain benefits to people with certain titles or backgrounds, which is unfortunate because, just because someone happens to have some degree or some success in some career doesn't immediately make them more credible or believable or valuable as an observer than a farmer or a hunter or, you know, someone that is on the lower rung, let's say, of the socioeconomic ladder. Now, UFOs being a worldwide phenomenon that are experienced by people all over the world because they seem to be fairly limitless, you do have a larger variety probably of categories of witness. But with the Sasquatch in North America, well, they happen in wild places. And so the people that tend to see them the most tend to be people that live in or at the edge of those wild places. And the majority of those are not people who have like C-suite positions working in corporate towers downtown in major cities. You know, they tend to be very often, like we talked about, you know, the sort of cultural stigma associated with like North Georgia, for example, Southern Appalachia, you know, deliverance and that sort of thing. And so it's unfortunate that people want to look at witnesses maybe from that particular realm and dismiss them, and yet assign so much value to witnesses that are, you know, professionals, let's say, or military careerists, academics, etc. And so a lot of those great witnesses, like I was mentioning, that are not willing to go on the record having seen a Sasquatch, they're like, well, I don't want to be associated with the sort of Joe Six-Pack on the evening news who says he saw a Sasquatch. And it's like, yeah, but you could change that perception if you would just come forward and discuss it and describe it. Now, I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but, you know, through those experiences, interviewing so many people, interfacing with the environments where these things happened, like, to me, it's a very normal flesh and blood sort of animal that's analogous to other animals. And so it doesn't really change my perception of like my place in a metaphysical sense or dimensional sense, or even like a pecking order of the tree of life, let's say, sense. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
And one thing I was going to say, one of the interesting things about UAP, first of all, when I came into the topic and I said the exact same thing that you said, because to me, they're UFOs. Why are they changing the name? And I come from an aviation background, and someone who's a layperson to aviation said, well, what if what they're doing is not flying? And then you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Not using Bernoulli's theorem, not beholden to Newton's laws of motion, which is how we create lift and how everything that I know of on Earth flies. So, and then the director of the UAP program in the Pentagon said, well, you know, we're seeing these under the ocean. So you're like, what? Wait. So that's when it went from unidentified aerial phenomenon to unidentified anomalous phenomenon, because submarines have clocked these things doing Mach underwater, something that from a hydrodynamic standpoint we couldn't do. So so that's why, is that they're undersea, they're in the air, but they're not exactly flying, because they don't need the air to create lift the way that we do. They can just hover in one position for 8 hours and just hang out. There's like nothing on Earth that could do that. So anyway, so that's where, you know, that UAP term comes from.
Well, words collect so much baggage, you know, because they get associated with media representations and hoaxes, and, you know, they become pejoratives. And so like, I can't stand the word Bigfoot. I try to never use it. Sasquatch to me is a much more appropriate term, in that it sort of dually handles a lot of the weight of the indigenous traditions, but it's also reflective of a modern term, because it is an anglicized term, or you could say bastardized term, that J.W. Burns coined in 1929.
Anglicized, Nathan. Okay.
But it's so funny, like, to see the American sort of version. If I'm recalling this correctly, because it's been a while since I've looked into this particular aspect of the history, but I believe that one of the indigenous words for what we would call, or we would recognize as, the Yeti, which unfortunately there's too many things that get housed under that category, because Yeti basically means that thing there. It has about the same categorical power as creature. So you could say, well, what's a creature? Well, a bear's a creature, and a cougar's a creature, and a moose is a creature. And so Yeti, you know, depending on where you are in the Himalayas or that greater region, can refer to a number of different things. But anyway, one of the local words for these mystery apes was Meto Kangmi. And when it was transmitted over the wire, the O in Meto accidentally was transmuted into like a C, which is Mech king means. So METOH changed to METCH. And the closest word that approximated that was filthy. And so when the English received it and they translated it, that became abominable snowman, which is not the root word is not, that's not the correct translation of the actual word. But it's like, what a terribly British thing, right? The abominable snowman, which is this, it's almost like erudite, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Versus in America, they find large tracks and they're like, Bigfoot. And then that name sticks, and it's so goofy and silly that's, so believe me, I understand how terms accumulate baggage over the years. And so I'm sure UFO has its own baggage, and Bigfoot as a word definitely has a lot of baggage.
I have no preference for any of those words, but there was I was in the same camp. I didn't understand why we went to UAP, and someone who was more venerable in the topic explained it to me a couple of years ago. And now the more I know, the more I understand. And as for Bigfoot, I just think it's kind of a cute name, but I get it. Why?
Yeah, I totally said
some-
Bigfoot at the beginning. Sorry.
Well, yeah,
Well, it's
well,
all
no.
good. Most people do. That's what most
Yeah.
people know. I just always I prefer Sasquatch just because to me it carries cultural weight.
It
Whereas
does make
Bigfoot just sounds so silly and funny.
Now that you explained it, I'm like, I'm never saying Bigfoot again.
Well, Matt spent 200 days in the woods to, I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of, as we say, it's a lot of skin in the game. You hear about David Grush and his testimony before Congress about UAP. A lot of skin in the game. Quit 2 careers. You've got a lot of skin in the game to spend, 200 days over 365 out in the woods. So,
well, there've been a lot of
wanted-
years of being in the field leading up to that. I mean, that was just
Yes.
it was 1 year where I was
Yes.
able to spend a year. And now, just to be clear, like those were not 200 consecutive days and nights.
Right,
I'd be
3
out
to
like
5
3 to
nights.
5. Yeah, and then
Yep.
and then come back. So there was a lot of hundreds of nights before that, and certainly since then too. But
which is amazing. I mean,
clarify.
that's a lot of skin in the game. It really is, to study. I wanted to get into behaviors. I'm curious that if you could have a window into an encampment, like let's say when it was inhabited, that the Olympia project, when that was actually inhabited by the creatures that we believe made those beds that have been now studied for the past, better part of, I guess we're more than 5 years now. What do you think you would see if you were to have a window into that habitation there, where you had the probably the young Sasquatch and the moms and so forth, and do you sort of buy into the sentries, the sentries sort of guarding those complex as such?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. With the Olympic Project nests, very good friend of mine, Chris Spencer, is heavily involved with that. He would be the best person to talk to because he spent so much, like my understanding of it is sort of from other people's descriptions, like Cliff Barrickman spent time there and Chris has described it to me. And so I don't know enough about it in terms of like, were they all constructed, season after season? Did they seem like they were all constructed at once? Because certainly, I think they found the first nest site was somewhere around like 15 or 17 nests. Now, certainly, I don't think that there's 17 individual Sasquatches that are like sleeping in close quarters. And so it's like, were those, are they built and constructed and used for a single night? And then on a return visit, the same individual might build an entirely new nest to sleep in. So there's so many layers of assumptions we'd have to go through of like, were they absolutely made by Sasquatches? How many individuals, like what do the constructions sort of look like in terms of a time frame? Is it seasonal? Is it nightly? Who knows? And so the model that makes the most sense to me, that sort of emerges from the as reliable reports as you can find, which is a tricky proposition because so much of that is subjective. What I find to be a reliable report, someone else might not. And believe me, there's plenty of reports that other people find reliable that I don't think are very reliable. And so it's very subjective.
But you clearly have thought about what those encampments would look like.
I wouldn't even call them encampments because, animals that, just for the nomenclature to be correct. Like, I don't think that they have a central hub that they like radiate out of and return back to, because a lot of far-ranging animals just don't live that way. Now, again, for good analogous animals might be something like black bears or brown/grizzly bears, or I very often invoke the tiger, because
Yes, the
tigers
tiger.
have very large home ranges and they're highly mobile in those ranges. Now an animal's range will be as large as it needs to be to sustain that particular animal, so they vary wildly across the same species. So black bears in the southern Appalachians have very small home ranges because the environment is so rich. Like where Nathan is, some of those counties like Transylvania County get 110 inches of rainfall a year.
Wow.
Much more than like certain Pacific Northwestern counties that are considered temperate rainforest.
Rainforest.
But there's 135,000 square miles of southern Appalachia that are temperate rainforest, and they're much more biodiverse and much more productive in terms of productivity per land unit, per square mile, let's say. So if you have the same species of black bear, individuals of the same species that are the same size, let's say, in southern Appalachia, they might only require 16 square miles of habitat, whereas that same individual might require 50 to 70 square miles of Pacific Northwest habitat. It takes that much more area to produce the same amount of food that this much smaller part of eastern deciduous temperate rainforest in southern Appalachia produces. And so really, when you're looking at those analogous animals and trying to extract lessons from those, again, like lateral thinking or associative thinking to apply to the Sasquatch, you could see that, okay, well, you can look at reports and plot them out, especially over time, in places that haven't been too affected by human progress, that have remained fairly stable and intact, environmentally speaking, over the last however many, let's say 60, 70 years, something like that. And so you see that, and Krantz did this with certain reports in the Northwest, et cetera, but that you see that sightings of females and or young. So sometimes they're together and sometimes it's just juveniles. So basically, Sasquatches that are only 4 to 4.5 feet tall, something of that nature, they tend to be in the more far-flung areas, further removed from human habitation. Now, occasionally they do still have roads that cross through them, but by and large, they tend to be away from places like that. Whereas the majority of sightings do happen at the boundary or the fringe of human habitation, and they tend to be of lone males. And so I think very often, because gorillas have a sort of system where certain lone males will post up and watch while the rest of the group is sleeping, and those get referred to as sentries. And so people try to apply that to the Sasquatch. So I think there might be some validity to that, but I also think it's being derived from the fact that what most people see and report, at least, are lone males at the fringe of human habitation, the edge of like rural agricultural plots or homesteads, are very often crossing roads. And so if you look at, again, let's say that southern Appalachian black bear, the male has a home range of 16 to 18 square miles. The female ranges are much smaller. They're more like 4 to 5 square miles. And so you might have these clusters of female ranges and the male overlaps multiple females. The same model is true of tigers. They operate in very much the same way, where, a male's range is about 1,500 square kilometers for Siberian tigers, and the female ranges are more like 400 square kilometers. And so I think when you apply those sort of social models to the Sasquatch, and you're looking at reports and trying to differentiate based on what the eyewitness claimed to see, because Sasquatches are described as apes, and so females are notable because they have visible mammary glands. And so that's the number one differentiator, that people go, I think what I saw was a male, or I think what I saw was a female. And then you look at juvenile sightings, or Krantz even found that very often sightings of male-female pairs, like consort pairs, what he presumed to be consort pairs, all happen in those more protected areas. Now, a home range for something like that might be, if I'm being, let's say in southern Appalachia, it could be as small as like 70 or 80 square miles, whereas in other parts of the country, it'd be much larger. But if they're always on the move in an area that big, because, 70 square miles is nothing to sneeze at. That's a pretty big area. Now, It might be more like 400 square miles in other places, I don't think that there's enough resources for them to be encamped somewhere where they're radiating out, getting resources, and returning to the same place every night. It's probably more of just being highly mobile, following resources that are pretty ephemeral, because especially here in the East, like where I spend a lot of my time where Nathan is. We've got seasonal resources and they're patchily distributed. It's not like oaks that produce acorns are evenly distributed across the whole forest. There will be these patches, and the same with other, berries or, other food resources. And then you have mobile prey, deer, wild hogs, things of that nature. Those are always on the move. And so that sort of lifestyle doesn't lend itself to, having a sort of a home base. Does that make sense? So I know it's a long-winded sort of answer to try to explain.
I wouldn't expect to see rattan, nightstand and maybe a papasan chair, no furniture setups or anything because they're too mobile and they don't want to carry the furniture.
And that's part of the problem of trying to observe or to pursue or to predict where an animal that lives that sort of lifestyle will be. And especially the larger that range is. And so again, it could be as large as in some place. I've heard Dr. Jeff Meldrum and other people think that they have a range up to 1,000 square miles, which to me seems a little on the large side, but that's a more sort of conservative estimate because, the larger it is actually the more conservative estimate because the larger the required range, the fewer of them you will have. Whereas I've met people who said, oh, they only need like 3 square miles. And it's like, if that were true, we'd be tripping all over them because they'd be everywhere.
Right.
They'd probably require quite a lot of room and resources, et cetera. And so an animal like that, I mean, there are many tiger biologists who spent, over a decade in pursuit of individual tigers because, tigers have idiosyncratic, their paw prints, what they call pug marks. You can identify individuals via that. And because a lot of their behavior is learned, it's not hardwired, baked in, innate.
Interesting.
They will have idiosyncratic methods of hunting and killing. And so you can identify by the way a prey animal was killed and the pug marks an individual tiger. And there are some tigers that people studied for over a decade and they never saw the tiger. They only ever saw the kills and the pug marks. And so you could imagine that, something that's at least as intelligent as a large cat and probably more intelligent. That's also, in much denser environments here in, again, Southern Appalachia, at least. The Pacific Northwest has some openness, but, it's jungle thick in Western North Carolina, a lot of parts of it. You get in those rhododendron thickets and it's like, you can't see 30 feet, then you start to understand like how it could be that an animal that size could remain sort of unrecognized, let's say, because they're not undetected. I mean, we've got many reports, like lots of people claim to have detected them many times. You know what I mean? So undetected is not quite the right word, but maybe unrecognized for sure.
Well, Matt, you have these guys who are experts in bushcraft that say that in their opinion, Sasquatch is better at bushcraft than they could ever hope to be. So, that tells the story. They know their environment better than we'll ever know it because they're not going to go home and take a shower and upload their SD cards. This is where they're going to be. But let me give it over to Money Nathan. And we got about 45. We might go about 10, 15 minutes over tonight. But we got to... Oh boy, do we have a lot going on, especially with me here.
Material.
So
yeah,
Money, go ahead, brother.
Yeah.
I know. I feel like we should PayPal Matt for these answers.
Excellent conversation. So, and you kind of touched on some of this, Matt, with the last response that you gave, but that's the degree to which, and you touch on this in your book as well, with a creature like this that is elusive, highly intelligent, that is seen rarely or glimpsed, every once in a while. There's not a lot of prolonged observation. The human imagination tends to fill in a lot of those gaps, and the tendency is to kind of like hyper mythologize the gap, like oh, it's a giant creature and it can do X, Y, Z. I don't really know that. I just sort of feel that, right? And so what is your estimation in terms of bridging that divide? Like how will that be accomplished? Is it just we're going to get lucky and be able to study these more closely? How will we go about kind of dispelling some of the mythology around the animal and getting closer to the real nature of the creature?
I think we'll just have to undergo the same process. Again, if these animals exist, which, I'm obviously convinced that they are, but I understand that the world at large is not. And so I find myself making that caveat a lot. It's like, well, the phenomenon exists. What's at the root of it? Potentially these potentially there are animals that fit these descriptions. And so, but if they exist, then they would just have to undergo the same process that analogous animals that had accumulated the same sort of lore, mythology, supernatural beliefs, or given supernatural attributes, metaphysical attributes, etc. And so when I was first getting into the subject and was confronted with people that had supernatural leanings or saw the Sasquatch through a metaphysical lens, I found it really off-putting, which was totally, my shortcoming. I wasn't being charitable, and I knew so very little about, let's say, like the normative state of human cognition and how what we might call magical thinking. And I don't mean that as a pejorative. There's just no really more accessible term, but that is the normative state of human cognition, of human perception, of, that's the substrate of the human psyche, which is why a lot of these ideas, beliefs, attributes, whatever you want to call them, apply to similar animals cross-culturally, globally, around the world, and have for as long as they have. And so I try to accomplish a couple of things simultaneously in the book where it touches on those points. Is that I try to demonstrate that upon essentially first contact, when non-natives came to North America and began to record encounters with indigenous belief systems, oral traditions, narratives, essentially what we would now call traditional ecological knowledge. You can see in their writings where they're recognizing things within the known and accepting that as environmental knowledge. And so it might be, information about bears, or let's say landforms or certain terrain features. But in almost every instance where they're describing ape-like creatures, non-human, much larger than a human, disproportionately long arms, no neck, tend to be nocturnal, have a foot that's about 1.5 feet long, all the things that we would call Sasquatch, they would immediately dismiss it. And it's for a number of reasons. Like, number one, there wasn't really a good analog in the natural world. We hadn't discovered the lowland gorilla yet, for example. So there wasn't something that's like, oh, hey, it's kind of like a gorilla, what they're describing. It was just like, wow, this is strange. But two, they are associated with a lot of these supernatural abilities. And so when you read whether they're ethnographers sort of recording these stories, or some of them are in like personal correspondences or in, expedition logs, let's say, it's like, oh, well, let me trouble you with some of their wild superstitions that they believe in this hair-covered race of giants. And it's this very dismissive, oh, can you believe this hogwash sort of attitude that's being presented to it. And that is carried forward right up until modern times with the Sasquatch phenomenon in general, but especially when it comes to people that see it through a lens that is a supernaturally tinted lens. And so if we're trying to posit that these are real living animals and they've always been around, it's like, well, how do we deal with those sorts of claims? Well, I try to look at, say, okay, well, these animals are very large by all descriptions. They're very rare, and they're highly mobile in what seem to be large home ranges. And they're very frightening for a number of reasons, not just the physical size and sometimes intimidating behaviors. So it's like, well, what other animals are very rare and wide ranging and frightening? And two good analogs are, brown bears or black bears, but brown bears are a great example because they extend into, Eurasia and Japan and, other places, and tigers. And so when you look at the indigenous, traditional ecological knowledge associated with tigers and bears, you find the exact same supernatural attributes associated with them in Asia, in Africa, that you find associated with the Sasquatch in North America. And so there's something about the experience of these things. Like, to give you a good example, one of the things that's common across these various cultures with regard to these animals is a belief that, they act in this sort of moral way. They're almost like a moral judge, and that they have these prescient telepathic abilities. They can know either the contents of your mind, which is sort of a telepathic thing, or they know the contents of your heart. So intention, almost a moral dimension. And so you could imagine, like, well, what would give rise to that sort of a belief? Well, if an animal is very wide ranging and is highly mobile, it's going to be encountered very, very, very rarely. And especially the further we go back in time, when social units are smaller and smaller and smaller. We're not talking about, gigantic cities. Later, there are chiefdoms and things like that. But let's say a village, a tribe, or a social unit like an extended family. Members of that social unit, only one of them might see one tiger each generation. It could be that rare. Let's say in Siberia, for example, with the Udajay, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and some of these other people, Usuri, I believe. And so they would be serendipitous and almost random. And then if you were to tell your other members of your social unit, hey, I'm going to go take you to where I'm going to show you this thing. You'll never see it, because by the time you get back to that point, it's, however many miles away, and it might not return to that place again this year. Who knows? And so you would experience that phenomenologically. It would be as if you can only see them when you're not looking for them. And so that belief is sort of projected onto the animal in a lot of these places, is that they know when you're looking for them and they won't allow you to see them. You will only see them when you're not looking for them. And as a moral dimension, you'll only see them if you're pure of heart. And so there's all these beliefs, like not just in Siberia, but like down through parts of India and the Sundarbans, that like a tiger won't kill a person who's free from sin. So there is this sort of like how to conduct yourself in the world, moral dimension to, hey, these things are dangerous, but if you do your chores and you treat people well, maybe you won't get eaten. But also, like, they'll know when you're, don't bother looking for them, because they know when you're looking for them. And then you go to Africa with both the lowland and mountain gorillas, and the same beliefs are associated with gorillas. And it was also seen as like they had this sort of prescience that they knew when you were looking for them, and you could not see them if you were looking for them. And you'll hear today people say things like, you don't find Sasquatch, Sasquatch finds you. Like contemporary 2023 researchers, which is just an extension of that same idea, because something is being experienced that has a fairly rational explanation, but because we experience the world through that sort of metaphysical lens, we put the onus on the animal. Oh, the animal knows we're looking for it. It must have some ability to know. And it's the same with, hopefully I'm not going on too long for your time frame here, but another thing that's shared across those is this belief that these three animals, the Sasquatch, the bear, the tiger, the gorilla, can paralyze you with its gaze. It can freeze you. It would hypnotize you, freeze you. Essentially, they turn to stone, so to speak. Now, if we look at our own evolutionary history, the innate freezing response to fear, which is called tonic immobility, is a conserved response that's shared across all primates. When in our evolutionary history, when we were living in trees and we were very small rodent-sized primates, which is the bulk of primate existence before they fractionate out and become monkeys and apes, they were hunted by motion-seeking animals like cats, snakes, and birds. So the individuals that froze when a motion-sensing predator was around, they survived and passed on their genes, and so that became an innate response. And so, very few things will generate that response in you, especially as we became, modern Homo sapiens. We're sort of, we spent a long time at the middle where we ate a lot of things and a lot of things ate us, and then eventually we worked our way to the top of the food chain. So once we're at the top of the food chain, there's probably very few things that could freeze you in your track that could trigger that response, because most of the animal world, size is very rare, large size. That's why there's, a trophic pyramid. Most things are smaller than us that we encounter, rodents, reptiles, on and on and on. So when we would encounter these big, rare animals in that once in a lifetime, once in a generation sort of setting, they probably did experience tonic immobility, the innate freezing response, and a bit of, overwhelming fight or flight terror. And so in those belief systems, the onus is put on the animal. It did that to me. Not that, oh, well, there's something conserved. I mean, you could hardly expect pre-experimental societies to posit that there's a conserved biophysiological, like neurological response to fear, so it makes more sense to go like, hey, if you run into one of these things, it can freeze you. It'll paralyze you. You won't be able to move, rather than thinking that it's an involuntary response. And so I think most of what the paranormal proponents in the Sasquatch realm believe today are all the same ancient ideas. They've just updated the nomenclature. So tigers, bears, and gorillas are thought to mediate between worlds, very often either the spiritual and physical realm or the worlds of humans and animals, because these, they were seen as sort of separate worlds.
Mhm.
And people believe the same thing about Sasquatch in older times, and they believe it today. It's just now they call it interdimensional. It's the same idea as the physical realm, spiritual realm mediation. It's just it's updated to a term that has more of like a science-y root, or it sounds more scientific. And it's the same with this idea that a Sasquatch could know the contents of your mind or heart. That has been transmuted into being associated with psi abilities or telepathy or things of that nature. And so people are still, I can't tell you how many people I meet that are like, well, I don't engage in magical thinking, but interdimensional, it's like, well, no, we all do. We've just changed the nomenclature to pretend that we're separate. But it's like, make no mistake, the cultures that created these mythologies, we are exactly the same creatures, physiologically, biologically, cognitively. It's like a smartphone.
Matt,
like we're the same models and units of phones. We might have some more apps, like the science app today, but we are the same units, processing the same information.
Well, I have the sleep app, but I don't know about the $8.99 a month to pay for it, but I might now that I'm working up here. So anyway, what I want to ask you though is, which is a tangent on what you're speaking about, and we've asked a couple of other researchers because I heard a fairly famous researcher, and you'll probably know who he is. It was Christopher Noel, posited this theory, and so. If I were to say to you, do you believe that people experience ghosts in their home? Do you believe in the existence of ghosts?
Well, it would really
just a yes or no.
Do people have experiences that they call ghostly experiences? Absolutely. Apparitional experiences, certainly.
Yes. Okay. So if it's possible for a human, then for some of these experiences in the woods that people have that are a little different. And I know a couple of people that have had them. Matt, our own Matt Knapp has had a couple of these experiences in the woods. Is it possible that a Sasquatch, that its ghost could inhabit a place that they once lived in the woods and do something that was inexplicable? Like, they'll say, well, I heard it walk up and I didn't hear it walk away, or, something like that. Do you think that's possible?
Well, what people call apparitional experiences are certainly real experiences because, again, they're described cross-culturally the world over, supported by probably millions of witnesses, because that seems to be the most prolific of the paranormal categories. And the UAP, let's say, in the most general sense, like unidentified lights in the sky or what appear to be discs or crafts. And in the Sasquatch, what appear to be some kind of animal, because they're hair covered. They have mammary glands. There's some kind of mammal, and they don't have tails or claws. They're probably apes. Now, to say that the ghost phenomenon, the apparitional phenomenon, can be attributed to, those are just the spirits of people who've died, and they're somehow stuck in limbo, and they're left behind. They don't know they're dead. They haven't moved on to anything. It's like, wait. There's a huge leap between what gives rise to the experience and that particular interpretation. Just like to see lights in the sky or what appear to be craft, to say, they're absolutely extraterrestrials from another galaxy,
right.
And they've mastered space-time. Right. Or no, it's a breakaway civilization that's developed a technology that they're trying to hide from the human overlords and the elite ruling class. It's like, wait a minute. We're too far ahead in the interpretive schema to say that, okay, well, yes, we can acknowledge that the phenomenon exists, but we can also acknowledge that we don't understand what the root of it is or the source of it. So I think to take two unknown phenomena, the Sasquatch phenomenon and apparitional, what we call ghosts, spirits, whatever the case may be, and to try to say, well, the things that are in common about them in various settings might be because they're connected or they have a relatedness. Whereas I would say, well, what do they have in common the most? The thing that they have the most in common is that they're detected by the human observer.
Sure.
And so if humans see the world through certain, we have these, it would take a long time to try to accurately describe it, but the way that we project archetypal elements onto novel or unknown phenomena. and we have, we're a repository of these certain archetypal motifs, that it's no wonder that we project the same archetypal motifs onto multiple unknown phenomena, even though they're not related. But you're basically, if you're looking at everything through rose-colored glasses, everything's kind of rose-colored.
Everything's red. Yeah, it may have no relation at all. It's within the realm of if there's such a thing as ghosts. For humans, it's possible. I guess. I don't know. And
that's the big if. And I'm not trying to dismiss it.
Yeah.
I mean, I find a lot of the near-death experience literature fascinating, and people that have written about or tried to study it, it's very interesting. And so I'm not saying that there is no extension of consciousness beyond the physical death. Who knows? I certainly don't know. And I'm not qualified to, because I don't study that subject. But I would just say that that would have to be proved to some definitional degree in order to then apply it to another mystery, rather than to take these two mysteries. And because people do have anomalous experiences at the home or in the woods, right? And we're still trying to get to the bottom of all of that. But to first assume that there's a soul that survives death that manifests in an earthly form, it's like, well, that's one of many possible interpretations of the ghost phenomenon. And then to take the Sasquatch, which we don't even know if there's a living animal behind that yet, because there's no proof. There's a lot of suggestive evidence.
I believe it.
And then to say, well, if there's a living animal and it dies, its soul can survive in the same. There's many assumptions that have to stack up. What makes the Sasquatch so convenient as a fringe topic to study is that it doesn't require anything new. I mean, if we know that these very large apes coexisted with our genus in Asia for well over 1 million years, and they were large, omnivorous with a broad diet. They lived in thick, dense forests alongside our ancestors. And so if that lineage, whether it's that genus or the clade that produced that genus, they had access to North America multiple times in the Miocene through the Pleistocene. So everything exists within the realm of the known, that I could say, well, if the Sasquatch is discovered, it doesn't really introduce anything new. It just says, well, maybe something related to these apes got over here. That's it. Whereas these other fields, like, to get to the bottom of whatever UFOs, UAP are, which there's probably multiple phenomena responsible for, or multiple things responsible for variations of the phenomena, that might require a lot of new, and it's the same with whatever's behind ghosts and apparitions, where it's like, the Sasquatch should be the simplest one, although it's very elusive. And the wild thing about our society and the modern world is that people talk about ghosts and UFOs in such a common way and a very accepting, open way. Again, in the way that I just described, whereas I'll ask people, like, do you believe in ghosts? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, what do you think it is? And they'll rattle off, oh, it's the spirit of a dead person trapped between roads, and make it. And then I'll say, do you believe in Sasquatch? No, absolutely not. That's all hogwash. And so we live in a society where it's easier for someone to say that they made contact with a spiritual being than it is for anyone of any sort of status or education to admit that they might have seen an undiscovered ape. How is that the more radical or extraordinary of the claims? But that's the way it is. And so that's why I wrote this book, to hopefully destigmatize some of that.
And the book is called The Phenomenal Sasquatch. Wait, where's my Word doc? Yep, thank you. The Phenomenal Sasquatch, Seeking the Natural Origins of a Cultural Icon. And the author is the brilliant Matt Pruitt. Matt, you should read more books. I mean, that's what I figured out after this, is really you should read more, okay?
I read a lot. I've always got
I'm being facetious,
books sort of
Matt. Can you play along? I could tell that you read a book a day.
I try.
It's great.
So I wish everybody would read more books.
You're right.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. I mean, you have 3 readers that are on this. Actually, 4 of you. I'm the one that doesn't read that much anymore, but I need to. So I am inspired by what you do. Do you want to finish? Can you make a quick? Because I got to get people out of here. Can you make a quick hitter out of what happened in North Carolina during that? You said that was one of the most interesting of the 3 really interesting nights during that year of research.
To make it a quick hitter, I mean, it's a place that I've had experiences multiple times, mostly hearing those long bellowing moaning howls. And so we've gone back to that area specifically trying to get some thermal footage more than anything. And so we had the cameras down one drainage, and then something happened in camp at night while the thermal cameras were away. And one of the people that was there was a fairly staunch skeptic and slept through it and sort of didn't believe it. And then the next night, I'd moved all the cameras back to our primary portion of camp, and it came and visited his section of camp and scared the ever living hell out of this guy. And he became, less. He was sitting more on one side of the fence than the other, let's say. It would take a while to describe exactly what happened, but that's it in a nutshell. So I've been back many times and will continue to go back there.
I love it. I love it. All right, you don't need to share your secret spot, man. That's awesome, because nobody that's on the panel today, if Matt were here, he could talk about what he's seen. None of us have seen one. I've been out a few times, and now that I'm here in Georgia, I plan on going out, finding, and I'll probably hit you up to find out who I should look to go out, because I'm a beginner. I'm an okay woodsman, but I really need to be out there with experienced people.
I'll take it. I'm in North Georgia all the time for field research.
I would love to go out, because I believe that this exists as much as anyone can believe that this creature exists without having seen it, because I just believe in the credibility of. I believe what Cliff has seen in Bobo, and Matt, and just Doug and Jeff Harding and many others that I've heard. But let's go with, because we got to get people out of here. Let's go with Cabby goodbyes. Starting with Priscilla.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was great listening to you speak, Matt. It was like a really cool lecture, and I'm a nerd, so I love the way you were talking about it. I'm a biology background, so I never, that makes more sense to me what you said, and I'm super woo, but what you said makes sense. And yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It was great seeing everybody.
Oh, dude, it is always a pleasure to have you, Priscilla. And hopefully you can get there's another Bigfooter you could get in the show, because there's other stuff I want to go into.
I'll definitely be getting your book.
Yeah, and me too.
Thank you.
I will be getting that book too. I wanted to talk about disclosure with Matt, so we'll try to do a part 2, but I knew that tonight needed to be cut short due to some constraints. Debs.
Yeah, so I have the title for your next book, The Pursuit of Meaning, and I'm looking forward to you working on that because I think that would be a great book. I'm hoping you'll broaden this intellectual approach to include other things like, ghost, spirit, and, demons, and hopefully UAPs, and just kind of like get another book that combines a lot of information into one place. I'd really like to see that. I think you've got an amazing grasp of what needs to be done for people to approach this in an academic way. So thank you for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Very, very generous.
Money Nathan.
Yeah, Matt, it's been a real pleasure. You've done an amazing job expounding on your perspective and kind of mapping out the topology of phenomenal experience. And I think it's incredibly valuable. It's not only valuable for Sasquatch, but there's so many overlapping areas into UAP and other phenomena as you touched on as well. So I do look forward to hopefully having you back with us, because I think we can go a lot deeper in some of these areas and explore some other territory as well as we kind of continue to push these ontological frontiers. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Money, I would like to drag Matt into ufology. Like we need him over here, don't we? Right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we definitely like to drag you over into phenomenology. Yeah, and we'll try to get into what the implication on the next one. We'll try to get into what the implications of disclosure would be. But I'd be remiss. We have a gentleman in the chat named Mick. He's from the UK, and he's a medium himself. He has some pretty amazing. He sent me some video of a spirit next to him that you can physically see. You could physically see better than you could see these ghost shows. And he also has some work with a spirit box, some really good conversations with Fuggy, who he talks to all the time. But I was curious. He's curious. Do you know of Bigfoot in the UK?
I've not encountered anything claims or evidence wise that I found very compelling or credible. And it's interesting because a lot of the book looks into juxtaposing, like, is it strictly a psychological phenomenon or is it strictly a biological phenomenon? It's like, spoiler alert, it's both. Both things happen and they sort of intermingle. But I do think on the psychological side, or as almost a psychocultural phenomenon, if you look at when Finding Bigfoot became very popular, all of a sudden there was a surgence of claims. I'm not going to say sightings because, what is a sighting? Well, claims of sightings, claims emerging from the UK of Sasquatches that did not exist in the previous decades or even, let's say centuries. Now, yes, there are archetypal forms, the green man, the gray man of, is it Ben McDewey? I'm probably butchering that. So they're these sort of like mythological characters or archetypal figures that are wild man archetypes, let's say. But in terms of the modern history of observations and evidence associated with these large, upright, ape-like forms, there's none of that in the UK really until Finding Bigfoot spikes in popularity. So I do think that is evidence of, like, well, maybe there's to some degree a bit of psychocultural, I don't want to call it contagion, but the way that ideas, I guess diffusion might be the right word. And so, of course, that happens to some degree in North America. So not all the claims are true, even if Sasquatches exist. But I've not seen anything in the UK that would suggest that. The person to talk to would be Andy McGrath. So I would say to your member or listener there, Andy McGrath's book, he's got a podcast called Beasts of Britain. He's a great researcher. He'd be the person to talk to about that most specifically.
There you go, Mick, and thank you very much for answering that last one. I want to make sure we got him. Mick has been such a big supporter of our show. Anyway, Matt, thank you so much for coming on. It's a pleasure to listen to you and Cliff and Bobo. I've heard you on so many podcasts, and I was just like, man, I would love to get that guy on. Luckily, I became friends with Tim Halloran, so he could make this happen. And I'll reach out to you once I get a house, get my backpack up here and my gear and ready to, my hiking boots and ready to go out in the forest. And once again, it's an honor. So on behalf of Matt Pruitt and Nathan, Debs, and Priscilla, this is DJ saying peace out, one love. We'll see you down the road. And as always, we're wondering what's up around the bend.